Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Watch Club. I am Newburyport Documentary Film Festival Program Director James Sullivan. We are very excited to have three of the principal people involved in the making of A Reckoning in Boston, which is a fantastic and very important new documentary that PBS just rolled out a couple weeks ago, I think, on racial inequality and systemic racism, both in Boston and beyond. So we have the filmmaker James Rutenbeck will be joining us in a few minutes. Co-producer Kafi Dixon and her friend Tolga Shields, who's in the film, are going to be joining us in a minute. But in the meantime, let's just take a quick look, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, at the trailer for A Reckoning in Boston.
In a city with a troubled racial past,
I have had enough. This community has had enough.
the rich are getting richer
If you're in development here in the city of Boston, this has become your paradise.
and the poor are getting desperate.
If we look at the people who have made wealth, they are not brown folks.
Kafi Dixon
There are more people feeding their beasts than they're human.
and Carl Chandler
Everybody has dreams and aspirations.
are trying to move forward by studying the great minds of the past
We take seriously the dictum of Thomas Aquinas: first seek to understand.
in a city that's leaving them behind.
Everywhere I go, there's housing being built, but I'm homeless.
It is human nature to want every unfair advantage you can get and not to be concerned about others.
God, if these people are evicted, where will they go?
You're surrounded by a world with which you feel out of step.
Every 35 hours, a black man is shot by a cop in America. We throw away red, black, and brown young men at the drop of a hat.
We represent the Boston that we're fighting for right here.
It becomes like a fire inside of you.
That fire can consume us or can burn the whole thing down.
A reckoning is coming.
You are not expected to aspire to excellence. You are expected to make peace with mediocrity.
Justice is not just what you do. Justice is who we are.
A reckoning in Boston.
Please welcome co-producer Kafi Dixon and her good friend since childhood, right? Tolga Shields.
Yes. Yeah.
Hi, ladies. Thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it. This is such a powerful and well-made film. I watched it for the second time today to prepare to talk to you. And I guess I want to begin by just asking you, from what I can tell, the response to it. I mean, obviously this rolled out on PBS nationally, but people saw it all over the country, right?
Yeah.
What has the response, like, has the response surprised you, or is it, how has the response gone? I know that it's gotten some really nice recognition, the film, and I'm wondering if that took you by surprise, or if you knew, after seeing the finished product, that it was pretty hard hitting and powerful and it was going to hit people.
Yeah. And I thank you for having us here tonight, and for, again, the acknowledgement of the documentary. And around the response, James and I talk about this a lot. One of the reasons that I participated in the documentary, it was because I felt that stories like mine and Tolga and so many other women who are in our community, who we've grown up with, some who have survived, some who have not survived in the city, that that's a very untold perspective that often I would hear from my interns that they weren't even aware that there was an African-American community in Boston after being 3 or 4 years, or they'd have this enlightening moment where they would recount being told not to come into certain places in Dorchester and Mattapan, and how they felt safe amazingly here.
Right.
So to participate in the documentary, I did realize that it would be a hard pill to swallow by the city. But I also said to James that there were a lot of people who spent a lot of time in Boston who this documentary will be healing for them around finally talking about race when race was off subject in very progressive liberal places.
Yeah.
And to actually put a finger on how spectrums of racism, bigotry, and marginalization, what that looks like, even for very kind, well-meaning people. So nationally, there's been an outpouring. In Boston, people are in Boston, it's been difficult. People have been trying to hide from the documentary or the
Really?
conversation.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Well,
And blatant about it.
okay, so
Yeah.
one of the reasons why we really wanted you to join us here is that the Newburyport Documentary Film Festival, we've been around for this is our 18th year. We're based obviously in Newburyport, which, as you know, is 40 minutes north of Boston. It's a relatively affluent community.
Yeah.
But we also have, like Boston, kind of like a mixed bag of racial history. I mean, so Newburyport is where William Lloyd Garrison was from, who was the, sort of main abolitionist in Boston in the 19th century. There's a statue of him in Newburyport. So like people here in this corner of the woods are proud of, being on the right side of history. But we also live in, let's be honest, like a pretty white suburb, right? And, I lived in Boston years ago, and then moved outside of town to be able to afford a house. When you say that people are, that it's been a hard pill for people to swallow in some ways. I mean, I moved away from Boston after I lived here as a younger person, partly because of the Charles Stewart thing. And knowing that, I mean, I was a kid when busing went on, but that history is painful for people around here. And it was very disappointing to feel like I was from a place where those things could happen.
The city has depended on an amnesia around Boston. I went to Endicott College to speak to some of the young women there, and the organizer, Reverend Dr. Cantor, provided me with this book called Mingo about a enslaved man in Beverly who was promised his freedom whenever the tide went low enough that he could walk to a connecting island or a rock. And that the story goes, from what I understand, that he wasn't, in his lifetime, he was not able to get the freedom his plantation owner promised him because the tide did not go low enough.
Wow.
So this perspective around progressiveness and affluence, but this unspoken legacy and being of despair.
Yeah.
So, and here's the thing. I try to remember if I've ever talked about racism in the documentary. I do talk about the difference between Black and white, but I don't know if I necessarily in the documentary call out racism.
Not really, right?
Which is so strange, right? I don't necessarily believe that affluence is race.
Yeah.
And Toga and I both grew up in communities and we experienced as children and young mothers, extreme poverty, but we also did have access to community. I can speak for myself. I don't know if you, my father's family is from Newton, Massachusetts, and my mother's family is from Melrose, when the world is a dry town, it may still be. And we're New Englanders through and through.
Right. You can hear it in your accent.
Yeah. Like, what are you talking about? Be careful going across the street to get in the car. So the funny thing about it is we've been in a lot of white spaces. And to me, white spaces don't necessarily say racism. Does it say it to you? Do you feel that? I'm sorry. We're talking my plate just hanging
I
out.
feel like it's such a constant thing that I wouldn't call it racism, but
Yeah.
it's certainly tension in some spaces.
Yes. Right. So I want to jump around a little bit, and I guess James is already ready to join, but we're going to keep him in the waiting room for a minute. At the end of the film, Kafi, you get the opportunity to buy a house.
Yeah.
Is that where you're sitting now?
Yeah, it is actually.
And
Yeah.
Tolga, are you visiting, or are you staying, or where?
I'm visiting.
Yeah. Okay.
We have promised to get old together. So as friends, we have our retirement plan stuff.
Good.
In Western Mass.
Right.
That is the dream.
So maybe I'll ask you one more thing, and then we'll invite James into the conversation. But I have a lot of questions for you both. I mentioned the thing about Boston's sort of very, very uncomfortable history in terms of race relations, especially 30, 40 years ago. But there's also been a lot of progress made since then.
Yes.
And again, like the William Lloyd Garrison thing that I mentioned, Boston also is a home. Martin Luther King studied here.
Yeah.
This is the home. Boston was the home of the abolition movement in the 19th century. To what extent do you both, as lifelong Bostonians, feel? But also Boston has this bad reputation. People say Black athletes don't want to come here because they hear that it's a racist city or whatever, right? Things are better now, but things can always be much better than they are now, and certainly than they were. To what extent is Boston unique, and to what extent is it similar to every other American city in terms of race relations?
I will speak quickly and then, provide the space for Tolga's perspective.
Yeah.
There may be varying perspectives. At one point in my life, when I moved back, I had moved to Connecticut and raised my children. I was living in Hartford, Bloomfield, and sent them to school in Simsbury and worked for the JCC. And I think that was another important time in my life of seeing people's kindness and acceptance of me in those spaces. And coming back to Boston and missing that countryside of Connecticut, I remember exploring New England more. And I spent a lot of time in Newburyport, especially with the sweet salmon that you guys have right there, and biking to Plum Island. The community is an asset to any Bostonian who chooses to use it in this day and age. So, I traveled to Kennebunkport, I traveled to Newburyport, and I didn't feel, and to be honest, again, affluence and wealth doesn't necessarily, to me, say racism, but I can clearly tell you it's specific instances where in our lifetimes we felt the racism or heard the racism or have been examples of racism within the city. And that's the thing that people, I wanted to say that I don't believe wealth and affluence necessarily says racism. There may be a disconnect that James talks about. But it doesn't say that that disconnect is based on feeling that that person that's other than you in race, class, or culture is less than you. But I think that Boston has always pivoted its poor, positioned its poor white working class against an impoverished Black working class. For many resources, and including in the 60s and 70s and even 1950s, if you talk about redlining and land policy, I think that Boston was very nuanced in ensuring that if you weren't white from South Boston, Irish American living in the city, claiming the Bostonian flag, that you were unable to thrive in the city. And it's become its own machine that I don't think that people know where it begins or ends, but because there's so much money attached to it, wealth development, that people are not willing to address how to dismantle that machine.
Right. Tolga, can you tell me how are things going for the community garden project that is, a big piece of the film? Hopefully you've established one, or it's going. Is it happening now? Are you guys doing it?
We are doing it. we have chickens to feed. We have actually
Oh, right.
chickens.
So just so everybody knows, they were almost late joining this broadcast because they were getting chicken feed.
We went to Tractor Supply and got a bag.
Tractor Supply, right? Exactly.
Found chicken feed, cracked corn too.
But so did the city finally give you a piece of land, or did you, no. Yeah. Okay.
So here's the deal. And I want to be clear about this. The tokenized experiences, I'm sorry, I don't mean to take this over from you, but I do often try to protect the inner workings of the policy piece because it's very oppressive and there is a deep level of despair. I've been talking lately about burnout and not being sure how I want to continue this project.
Okay.
But when we talk about oppressive and racist policies are that the city finds it hard to figure out a way to give a Black woman land.
Right.
And I keep thinking, how is it so hard to give me, a Bostonian, and let's not say it's based on race, class, or that I'm in a butter.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you find it hard to look at an organization and an initiative that supports Black women and marginalized women's health,
right,
not figure out a way to just say, here's the land? What are the deep rooted pieces of that say it's closer to impossible rather than possible? And that was a city employee who told us that, what is his exact words?
He said, we put the city on blast.
This was recently.
Okay. Oh, the employee told you to do that? But said, don't use my name, right?
No.
He actually said, how do you expect to get what you need or want when you're putting the city?
I see. Right. Okay. Right.
Mm-hmm. And so he said to me that it's essentially the backhand of that was, if we played along, we would have gone along further. But it was just like, we're going through this for almost 5 years before the documentary, and you still haven't given us the land. So it was strange, but essentially he was asking us to toe the line, and that's not the first time we as Black women have been asked in many situations to toe the line around what are racist policies or designing community.
Right. Let's bring in James Rutenbeck, the filmmaker. Hi, James. How are you?
Hi.
Also, James.
Hey, hey, James.
Coffee and Tolga. Squish in. There you go. That's perfect, actually. Yeah.
It looks like a photo booth.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So thanks everybody for being able to join. James, can you for the benefit of anybody who's watching this or sees this that hasn't had a chance to watch the film yet, do you want to quickly describe the Clemente Course and what you had originally set out to do?
Sure. Thanks, James. So I had gotten excited about this idea of making a film about the idea of transformation through engagement with art, philosophy, and history and literature through this course that's taught in 35 sites around the US. But we started out in Dorchester. It's a tuition-free night class in the humanities, year-long course for low-income people who have not had the opportunity to go to college. And the idea of the course and the idea of the power of the humanities, as we know, is that it can transform a person and make someone have a stronger sense of agency in their lives. And so that was that was my initial idea of the film, was to, in retrospect, I see it as a very limited kind of premise, especially after what happened in terms of what I learned over the course of making the film. But that was the original idea.
Right. So, okay. So that leads me to, we'll get to, sort of how things turn for you in the making of the film. But Kafi, can you tell me how your experience, so this is where you first met, obviously, you were taking the Clemente course. Kafi, would you mind telling me how it worked? How was the experience for you? Was it as worthwhile as hopefully you thought it was going in? And how did you find out about the Clemente course in the first place? Like, what made you decide to devote all those nights to taking the course?
I decided to devote all those nights to taking a course because it was a dirty little secret I was carrying for many years of my life that I didn't have a high school education. I went to high school for about 3 months to Boston Tech. And because of foster care, pregnancy, and losing my child's father, dropped out and ended up in this system, right? That took many years to get out of, the system of poverty and social services. And I was able to code switch that. Nobody in Boston or Connecticut knew that I was lacking a standard education. But in advocating for the woman before this turned into what it was, and writing emails with people not responding back about what I thought was something so just, like women growing food, organic food, right? In the day of Whole Foods. This was years ago. And I started internalizing their lack of response, that they had realized I didn't have an education, and that my email seemed ignorant in some form, or that they realized that my class was of a class of a woman that didn't have education, and that they naturally understood that I was a woman of color, and all of these things that went through my mind. So I saw the Clemente course, and the poster said reading and writing classes. So I was like, oh my God, they can teach me how to write it, but an email. And I went to the class and I met James.
Right.
And the experience with James was really interesting. A lot of people ask, what enabled me to trust him to bring him into my world. And I was just like, I know white people. I mean, I hate to say it like that, but I know I know other races and cultures, and that doesn't, because they're not my race and culture, doesn't automatically deem them terrible people.
Right.
If they're not of my class, it doesn't deem them terrible people. It's just, I hate to say this, but we know people who are not African American, who are white, who have been very kind to us. Maureen, Mo from Thompson's Island, who treated us with respect and dignity. So I didn't expect anything less from James. And there are usually some tells with people who are truly racist. So
yeah, sure. But but he was holding a film camera, and you didn't sign up for that necessarily, or he had somebody with him. I don't know, but you just went to the class to get to get that education, and then you're like, well, wait a minute, I didn't necessarily sign up to be in a documentary. How did that go? Like, how did that conversation go?
The time in Clemente was interesting because there started to be a realization in studying philosophy, in thinking about Antigone's dilemma, in hearing No from the City, in realizing that at the time, the land that we were occupying on Terrace Road in JP, that there was a lawsuit about it. And I'm asking women who were rightfully scared. I remember Toga walked by with her sister, and I'm out there digging soil, and I don't even think she knew I was out there. And they were like, what are you doing? I was like, planting crops. And that's before we came on this site. But I realized that I was standing on a multi-million-dollar property on Terrace Road, and that all of these lots, to an extent, even the undevelopable ones, I just thought it was land, right? I didn't know that with this land that somebody had placed a value on it,
right?
Deemed it a value that we couldn't match. So I was starting to feel afraid. I started to feel like something was going to happen to me. I was starting to get I had received threats from the city, and even when we did over that former lot, and I was threatened by the city on this lot, and I was like, "What the heck?" And I didn't know that. I did not know the dark side of development, of racism. I hadn't experienced that in so long. I was developing anxiety about it, and I thought that this project wouldn't make it, and that it would be lost, that this Black woman who is a trained rural and urban farmer, and who was trying to access land for other women like her to grow as I was leaving for Vermont, that it would be lost, that that we were trying to do something better for ourselves. And James, and divinity around the relationship, and to come in with a divinity around the relationship with that camera, to tell the story of the dark side that not only I was experiencing, that often Black women and men experience in the city of Boston, these untold stories that are mind-blowing, that James did become the point of communication for humanizing our experiences, that camera. humanized our experiences, that there were murders involved, that there
Yeah.
were threats by city officials, that there was evictions, and that on an eviction day in court, the day I'm supposed to be evicted out of my home, that the whole system can shift so that that one judge who commits all of the evictions in the city of Boston,
Mm-hmm.
who also is a fundraiser for Greater Boston Legal Services,
Mm-hmm.
who works with the free pro bono lawyers who are supposed to be representing women in court. He is the fundraiser for them. And they have to go in front and supposedly defend us as if they understand that he is he's who he is, like the executioner of housing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that there's no pushback. So you start to see how the whole system is connected.
Right.
And the only way I was like, if this system swallows me up, James is going to have.
He's documenting it, right?
Documenting it. And it did swallow me up, and we fought for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, right. So, thanks, producer Steve, for bringing James back. So that leads to my next, major question, which is, I think it's totally fascinating and totally appropriate that James, you go through this sort of, the reckoning that's in the title of the film, right? Realizing that the film really needed to be about something other than what you thought you set out to do, which is just documenting the Clemente Course. But then at a certain point, you approached Kafi, or had the conversation with Kafi and with Carl about becoming co-producers on the film, right? What I would love to know from both of you, or from all of you, is how did that conversation come about? Kafi, how were you surprised? Were you, did it make sense to you? Of course, yes. I'm deeply involved in this project. Of course, I should have a stake in it, right?
But that wasn't why Carl and I asked James to come into the documentary.
You asked him.
We did. We had brought in a team of people.
Yep.
Because I saw that it was painful for James. I felt, and he may feel differently, but we've talked about this before. The realization that people that you think you're in community with, like a Sheila Dillon, who seem nice on the surface,
right,
or gentlemen who are in that room, and I position it as people James would have dinner with. Yep. To have them pull James to the side and to call Ashara, myself, and Toga troublemakers, and walking into this meeting about our health, right? Our community health. And that I think how racism continues to exist in families and community is that there has to be one person who says, don't pay attention to that. We're not going to talk about Uncle... what's a good name? Uncle Johnny, who is the racist bigot, right? Uncle Al, who's a stone cold bigot. We're just gonna paint him in the best possible,
and then pretend that everything else is fine.
Yeah,
if we ignore him, right? Yep.
So but what happens when you do bring Uncle Johnny into public light? And the pain and the embarrassment of the family that you've never corrected him on his behavior, and now it's public to know that this sentiment exists deeply within this family. So I felt bad for James. Like, how are you witnessing racism? And it wasn't just me; it was other academics, Dr. Ona from Tufts University, that said a lot of our story is tied to James's story. And how does whiteness witness the pain and struggles of Blackness, and the realization that a lot of this is not our fault, and we're good people just trying to survive, right? Trying to be better community people, residents, neighbors.
Right.
And so I wanted to help James with that, but also realize that, as someone, Annie Hoffman, said, that James is her guide in witnessing. And in order for him to be a guide, we needed to hear his voice about how he felt looking at people who considered us troublemakers or being in housing court.
Right. James, that's basically exactly how, it's clearly how you come across in the film, is that, as a documentary filmmaker, you might do the voiceover, but, otherwise you're kind of staying out of the way, letting the story tell itself. And in this case, you are the witness, and you are, openly grappling with your own struggling emotions about this stuff, right? Did it make perfect sense to you to bring, I mean, I would imagine it did, right? To bring Kafi and Carl in as, principals on the making of the film, once you sort of passed a certain point with going down this road with them.
Yeah, I think that like one of the things that really, I knew the history of Charles Stewart. I knew the history of busing, and I learned more about it when I was making the film. But the thing that really sort of changed my thinking was the study that came out in 2015 about median household wealth between Black people and white people in Greater Boston. And we know, that's when we learned that for white people, it's $247,000, and for Black people, it's $8. And
median household wealth, right?
Median household wealth,
right?
And that was the thing that just stuck with me. And part of it, and I began to see, I was with people who were sort of living with that disparity, and I was with them in a way that I could not avoid,
right?
And so I think that I decided that I didn't want for our filmmaking team to replicate the inequality in the city within our own team. And that's something we're always working on, even now, is negotiating equity and trying to keep that in perspective and in mind at all times. And so that was the decision to bring my voice in the film was not my decision. That was, ultimately it was, but I was sort of pushed there by Fernando and Kafi and Nolan Walker. And basically, it was a group of people of color who sort of were urging me to come into the film, to bring my voice in, the thing that I least wanted to do. And what they were saying to me was, this isn't just, our story. This isn't just our story. This is all our stories.
Right.
Because we all live within these structures and systems, and we are all, I'm complicit, we're all part of it. So how could I sort of have this sort of privilege of being invisible,
right?
Being an observer,
right?
It's what I wanted to be, but
right.
Anyway.
Well, good on you for taking on that, kind of a burden. I mean, like of making yourself vulnerable, to make this such in part, it's a big part of why this is such a powerful film. We got just a few more minutes. I don't want to keep you all night. I just want to say that anybody who's watching the interview live, if you want to ask a question, this is a Q&A, and after all, if you want to ask a question, put it in the chat and on Facebook or on StreamYard. There we go. Okay. Sharon says, living just an hour north of Boston, we are your neighbors. Is there anything Newburyport residents, this I was getting here. Thank you, Sharon, for voicing this for me. Is there anything Newburyport residents could do to support your project or particular city? So I think Sharon means specifically the garden project, the urban garden project. But I also was going to say, just in general, what can people in the outlying areas who, do to be of more help than just sort of lip service?
And I want to make this clear when I talk about spending a lot of time in Newburyport, at Singing Bee, Manchester by the Sea, Gloucester. I do love New England. And I also want to be honest, the American dream affords us a perspective, regardless of how real or not it is, that we can all obtain a level of comfort and wealth in our homes. I mean, that is, we are not vowed to a life of poverty as American citizens. No one should feel guilty about their comfort in life or their wealth, right? I think it's just to understand that there are people participating in a system that are intentionally denying other people who are pulling themselves up by their bootstrap, if that's real, an ability to have wealth.
Right.
Our city councilor's name is Brian Worrell, and he's new. And we did a lot of work to get him into office. We did a lot of work to get Wu into office, a lot of fundraising, behind the scenes fundraising for her. We want Michelle Wu and Brian Worrell, Worrell, to think differently about how you do something that James did so easily, is to provide equity to a people.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And we're not being asked to, we're not a nonprofit. We do accept as a low profit entity assistance and financial support and donations, but we're not out there saying we're a nonprofit and we're forever going to be a charity.
Right.
We're saying that the city is dragging out a process and denying us access to land. And to be clear, and I'm sorry for going off, and I want the community to understand this, to figure out a way to give land to us is to figure out a way to give undevelopable lots to many women who are in this community. So there is an intention to not figure this out. But in getting in people like Michelle Wu and like Brian Worrell, is to assist them into knowing that there is a city, there are people who are watching Boston who are saying equity is just.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't make the call to City Councilor Worrell's office to support the urban farm being given to the woman, if you can call City Councilor Worrell, you can call Mayor Wu's office,
Mm-hmm.
call Maura Healy, who's another huge supporter of our work, who we are big supporters of her as well. As
she's going to be your governor, right?
Well, we don't talk like that, but if you can think about what it is to come out of South Boston and Charlestown and her story, and to rise to levels as Attorney General for the state of Massachusetts, and to become the defender and advocate for many that are marginalized in many situations, you can only imagine what she'll be able to do for the state of Massachusetts as a governor, and a lens of fairness. But yeah, Brian Worrell as city council, call his office and say, I saw the documentary. I'm calling from Newburyport, I'm from Massachusetts.
Yeah.
How can you figure out to give these women land? Right. You can also join us on meetup.com. Right now we have a meetup that says Women of Color Co-op. But it's actually being changed to Common Good Project. But there were 900 Black women sitting there waiting for the ability and resources to join our project. But we have to build capacity around that.
So tell me, Kafi.
One last thing.
Yeah.
We just had the Boston Public Health Commission deny us a grant to hire staff for the co-op. So what we're dealing with is very embedded, and is going to take the work of people from outside of Boston to encourage Boston to reconcile with some of its issues.
So if people want to contact you at what you're renaming the Common Good Project, right?
Meetup.com, Women of Color Co-op at meetup.com.
Okay.
Or on the Reckoning site, you can reach us, James.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, so if you go to the Reckoning in Boston website, you can also find links. Okay, great.
Yeah, and you can also find the link to our website, which is Common Good Co-op. You can become a member. You can get our newsletters, and when I get around to an impact statement, that too can be yours.
Okay, great. All good stuff. We actually have at least one or two other audience questions if you have a couple more minutes. So Sue St. Martin says, thank you all. This is so compelling and telling. What might be expected outcomes of showing this film, policy-wise or community representation or advocacy? Right. So what tangible things are you hoping can maybe come from people seeing this film? And not just in Boston. I mean, we talked when you first came on about the impact around the country for other communities that might be struggling with similar issues, or that are struggling with similar issues.
There's a famous quote that poverty is a policy decision.
Mm-hmm.
And the income wealth gap keeps getting wider and wider across this country.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to ask Toga, like, are we still impoverished? I asked her in the car, because I don't ever want to forget what it was to be a young mother at 21 with 3 children on food stamps and cracking open cans of corn, or going to below budget supermarkets that may have been a little suspect to free children. But it is a policy decision. And policies were used to get us in these situations. And it's only the proper interpretation or the rewritings of policy that are going to get us out of this situation, which is why we believe in being involved politically and encouraging women of color, and men of color, just vulnerable communities, not to give up on our elected officials, because they are trying to do good work. But it does take the vote of an individual or the phone call of an individual to make sure our elected officials are keeping their ear to the ground for their constituents.
Last question, I think. Second to last question, because I was going to ask the last one. Stacey Ann says, can you talk more about the overt and nuanced forms of economic racism by those not intending to be racist?
Oh, that's awesome. The Census Bureau says that there were 3 things that happened that should be noted by all. One important thing that happened is the 2020 census came out and once again noted that African-American communities are only communities that exist in a deficit and are being lost in the city of Boston. African-American people are being lost in the city of Boston as a culture and an asset to the culture. The economic racism is that with that culture being lost, we have to wonder, was it that business owner that could not open a restaurant, that had been stonewalled and slow rolled and denied the licensing to open a restaurant, to open a bar? We no longer have African-American, West Indian, Caribbean clubs in Boston. They've all been shut down for whatever reason or another, while there's been a rise in restaurants in downtown Boston, Seaport District, and Charlestown and South Boston. So the denial of economic assistance in a space that's heavily 501c3 is within its own spectrum of violence. To relegate communities of color to constant charity is a form of racism that does not provide an example on which we are ingrained into American culture as hardworking community assets, not just hardworking, intellectual contributions, physical contributions, economic contributions. But when racism bleeds into an inability to start the first co-op by Black women for women, that in itself says, and for them to tell me that they would give me the land if I was a nonprofit, when in the state of Massachusetts, nonprofits do not own anything. If the nonprofit that we started was to dissolve around this land, the women would not be equity owners because that land would have to be transferred to another nonprofit legally.
Right.
So to deny us economic development over a piece of land where they don't provide, where there have been lawsuits on lawsuits on lawsuits on integration into state contracts, city contracts, construction contracts, development contracts, homeowner assistance, to say that these lots that we've built and put 42 beds on, and our 7 chickens and our honeybees and all of the families that we've sat with in the watermelon bushes in the back of the lot and fed, that this is not something that deserves an economic support. Again, Boston Public Health Commission saying that we weren't, there were other organizations that were in more need of supports than us. And we are a public health initiative.
Right. Can one of you give us an update on Carl? I know we talked about him. I was asking about him joining this conversation. Apparently he wasn't available to do that. Is he doing okay, or
Carl is a strong person. He's been hit hard over the last couple of years. He got COVID early on and has long COVID. So he's dealing with the health, outcomes that are attached to that. And he's struggling. In some ways, I think that his housing situation isn't sorted out yet. We had hoped that this film might help him just get a decent place to live that was affordable. And that hasn't happened either, unfortunately. I still hope that it will happen. And I hope that he can return to Harvard and finish his studies there.
Yeah.
Can I point out 3 important parts of this? And this is why all varying perspectives are required.
Sure.
3 important parts of a national documentary with some of the highest ratings in Chicago, San Francisco viewership ratings about the city of Boston and the racism that we all know exists and still continues. That the 3 major points in the city that Boston can't even seem to move itself to resolve. 1, to hand over the land to the co-op, right?
Mm-hmm.
2, to reach out to Tolga about what was a very sensitive subject and touch base with her about that, resolving, right? Updating. And then 3, that Carl is still homeless.
Mm.
All issues that can only be solved in the city of Boston and are not. Carl is homeless. We have not yet heard from the City of Boston Police Department about Tolga's son, and we're being asked to toe the line and why that the city has not figured out a way to hand over land, which is a community and public health benefit. So those are only things that the City of Boston can solve, and it has not, even with a national documentary. So this is what we're up against. Where do our voices count? And the pressure will have to be from the outside in. And until then, we just try to keep fundraising to make sure to be able to sustain some of the work that maybe we may not have enough funds to do in the meantime until this project is embraced.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much for, I mean, I would love to continue the conversation. I don't want to keep you all night, but I would love to talk to you all again, have an opportunity to talk to you all again sometime soon. And hopefully we've opened some eyes and maybe gotten a couple people to call your city councilor or otherwise do something on your behalf because, more than well deserved. Thank you so much, all of you, for taking the time with us. And we hope we helped drive a few more people to watch the film and think about it and tell their friends about it, which is the whole point, right? So thanks again. I'm going to let you guys go off into the waiting room for a second because I'm going to give away a coffee mug.
Yay, we love coffee. We love coffee.
Great to meet you all. So we're just going to run the giveaway tool for the one of a kind. Well, no, there's actually more than one of a kind because I own one of these. Newburyport Documentary Film Festival coffee mug goes to one of the people asking a question today. It's going to be Sharon Kennedy. Sharon, get in touch with us. Email us through our website and let us know how best to deliver the coffee mug to you. For the rest of you, if you haven't yet watched A Reckoning in Boston, please do. If you have watched it, you know how powerful it is. Tell your friends and have them watch it and point them towards this interview, which will be archived on our YouTube channel. Thanks so much. Look forward to seeing you here in the same space again next month for the next edition of the Watch Club. I'd like to just say thanks to our sponsors as usual, and we'll see you soon.